Hi there, students. Thank you for being part of this presentation. My name is Luis Silva. Today we are going to be focusing on American Government, Unit 1, Foundations of U.S. Democracy, and the Development of U.S. Democracy. Today we will be focusing on two different topics. First, what was the Magna Carta? And secondly, what was the impact of Enlightenment thinkers on the development of U.S. democracy? The Magna Carta, a very old document, was actually put together in 1215. It is an important historical document that took some powers away from the king and gave some rights and freedoms to people. The Magna Carta means the Great Charter in Latin. Now, on June 15th, 1215, the barons of medieval England confronted the king. They were very upset and forced him to put his seal on the Magna Carta. King John had been very unpopular, who abused his power, oppressed his subjects, and angered the barons by increasing taxes and demanding many soldiers for his military campaigns abroad. So the king was being an absolute king, thinking that he could basically do anything he wanted. He could raise taxes. He could ask for people to go and fight for him. And this actually brought a whole bunch of conflict between those people that had the money and the king himself. So the Magna Carta, in a way, was there to put a stop on the king from doing whatever he wanted. The barons rose in rebellion and wrote the Articles of the Barons, which became known as the Magna Carta, and it contains 63 clauses promising: 1. All free men access to courts and fair trial. 2. Eliminating unfair fines and punishments. By the way, we are going to be looking at some of the specifics clauses as we move forward, especially those ones that relate to the United States. Now, the Magna Carta is often thought of as the cornerstone of liberty and the chief defense against arbitrary and unjust rule in England. So this was like a significant, monumental document that restricted the king in many ways. Now, for the first time in history, a ruler was placed himself, actually, under the rule of law. Before this, the king could basically do anything he wanted, and nobody actually dared to challenge him. And the Magna Carta actually said, no, that's not the case anymore. You, king, have restrictions. The Magna Carta was one of the forerunners of the U.S. Constitution and the first 10 amendments, which we know right now as the Bill of Rights. It became a symbol of the supremacy of the Constitution over the king. By the way, this is a principle that we use here in the United States, that the rule of the land is the Constitution. It doesn't matter what the president says. It doesn't matter what Congress says. Everything that is passed, everything that is enforced has to be in one way or another backed up by the Constitution written by the founding fathers of this nation. The foundations of democracy in England was laid out by the Magna Carta, which put restrictions on the absolute powers of the king. And, this was a big deal because at this time, not only in England, but in many European countries, the king was absolute, meaning that he had ultimate power. He could do anything. And on top of that, it was believed that the king was actually placed by God. So therefore, you could not challenge the king. If you challenged the king, it meant that you were challenging God. So nobody dared to challenge the king during this particular time period. Now, moving on to some specific clauses of the Magna Carta, we're going to be looking at clause number 12. The king is restricted in the types of taxes he can impose without approval of the Great Council, a group made up of nobles. So this in itself already limited the king because he could not go out and randomly place taxes on anybody unless he actually got permission. This restricted the king's ability to raise taxes for wars. This actually had been the main concern of the nobles in the previous years because taxes had been raised to fund a war against France. The nobility benefited because the Magna Carta define individual rights, and emphasize the role of law in society. Now, let's move on to clause number 39. By the way, these clauses relate specifically to the United States government and how we took some of the ideas of the Magna Carta and actually put them together in a U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. So clause 39 basically says that people should be punished only after a ruling by their peers, similar to a trial by jury here in the United States. In other words, the courts cannot come and tell you, hey, you're guilty of this, without having you to go to a trial where a group of people hear the arguments against you and in your favor, and they determine if you're guilty or not guilty. In this case, the Magna Carta, clause 39, actually emphasizes that idea. Also, the phrase "no free man" implies that all people should be treated equally under the law. And that's another concept that we have here in the United States, that everybody should be treated equally under the law. Unfortunately, in practice, that is not the case, because for the most part, if you're wealthy, you can defend yourself. You can get away with many things. If you're poor, middle class, and you do not have the funds to defend yourself, well, guess what? You're probably going to be found guilty. The Magna Carta restricted the king's ability to punish his subjects. So the king could no longer say you're guilty just because you're guilty, but your guilt had to be proven. Now, clause number 1 of the Magna Carta is a very important one because it emphasizes the connection between the church and the state in this case. So the church was exempted from the Magna Carta. Very interesting. The nobles made clear that the church should be free from interference of the king and nobility. In other words, nobody could mess with the church, either the government, in this case the king, or the wealthy, the nobility. An interesting point was that the nobles explicitly included the phrase "for us and our heirs forever," which basically means that they envision no point when government should be involved in the affairs of the branch, in this case the branch within the church itself. This can be seen as a precursor to the philosophy regarding separation of church and state that emerged in the Enlightenment. By the way, we're going to move on to the Enlightenment in a little bit, but it's a direct connection between Enlightenment thinkers and the Magna Carta, and later on Thomas Jefferson, which basically emphasized also the idea that there should be separation between the church and the state. Clause number 12 basically says that the king retained the right to tax the people on issues relating to a monarch's ransom and other things. By retaining some power to tax, the document implied that the monarchy was still an important aspect of government. The king could no longer come and say, we'll tax you on this and this and this, but actually he had restrictions on what and for what purpose he could actually tax. Now, moving on to clause 39, this was an influential clause because it dealt with the American Revolution. It outlined the individual rights of citizens. The early colonists considered themselves to be English. Please remember that. A lot of those colonies that made it to North America were English. So many of them still saw themselves as English. So they believed that they also were accorded these rights of the Magna Carta, which we now call the due process or due process. And in the list of grievances written by the colonists of the Declaration of Independence, the colonists mentioned instances where the judicial rights outlined in clause 39 were actually ignored by the king. So this was one of the reasons that was given in order to rebel against the mother country, Great Britain or England. And obviously this has to do with clause 39. By insisting on including the rights of individuals, the founding fathers made the Magna Carta an important ideal in the American Revolution. Now, when British settlers came to America in the 1600s, they brought this idea with them. They also brought provisions from the Magna Carta like majority rule and the right to due process of law, a speedy trial, and a trial by jury. When the colonies sat down to draft a constitution, they turned to the Magna Carta for some enlightening. Some of their ideas that were written in the Magna Carta and obviously Enlightenment thinker ideals became part of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the Enlightenment influence on the United States government. But what was the Enlightenment? We hear this concept of Enlightenment. Well, the Enlightenment was an 18th century philosophical movement of intellectuals who were impressed with the achievements of the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment thinkers' philosophy was an idea that people could approach religious, political, and economic issues through reason, thinking, and science. They believed people should not follow authority blindly, but instead they should stop and think about what they're being told. Intellectuals believed that by using the scientific method, they could improve their society. And a lot of the ideals and way of thinking that was put together in the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence actually came from Enlightenment thinkers. Now, some of the people of the Enlightenment, I'm just going to mention to you some of their names. This goes from the 1600s to the 1700s. You have John Locke, very important Enlightenment thinker. Mr. Hobbes, very important Enlightenment thinker too. Montesquieu and the separation of power. Rousseau from France. Voltaire also from France. All of these people are, by the way, they were more Enlightenment thinkers, but we're only going to mention those five for this lesson. And we're going to focus on two of them actually right now. So Enlightenment thinkers, you have Thomas Hobbes. He was a very smart person, and he used reason and logic to come up with very important points. Some of the points that Thomas Hobbes made is, first, the state of nature is a state of war. Second, a state of war makes people very individualistic. They only think about themselves. And this creates chaos and it could potentially create rebellions in a country or a place. He said human reason pushes for people to come together for protection. He also said that submitting to authority is a necessity for protection. So he actually believed that human beings, in a way, had to submit to higher authorities, in this case, the government, so the government could keep control and the government could keep society in peace. The preferred form of government is monarchy, in this case for Thomas Hobbes, which is needed for absolute authority. So he believed that a monarchy was the best answer for governments. And this is an initial Enlightenment thinker, and not everybody agreed with him. Later on, some people actually disagreed with him. They actually said that the monarchy was not needed. But this is the way he believed that in order to keep people together, in order to maintain order in a society, you had to have a strong government, a monarchy, and that monarchy was responsible for punishing those people that actually deviated from the norms or what was required from society. He also believed that self-defense is an acceptable reason for disobedience to authority. Now, moving on to John Locke. And these are some of the points that John Locke made. The state of nature is a state of isolation. He also said that sovereignty is dependent on the people. In other words, the people give the power to the government, those we elect. He also said that there is no need for absolute authority. Well, this kind of goes the opposite of what, if you see here, Thomas Hobbes said that in order to, have a peaceful society, a government, a monarchy was needed with basically absolute authority. So there you have a contradiction there. Both actually thought differently. Mr. John Locke also said that natural rights exist and occur without government. He also said that people willingly enter a social contract to allow themselves peace of mind. The social contract, in this case, with the government. You negotiate with the government, you elect government officials, and those government officials basically represent you, and they're not above you. That's what he's actually saying here. He also said that rebellion is permitted to prevent a society in which might might makes right. So Mr. Locke believed that there was no need for absolute authority and that people had the power. Very interesting point that he made. And by the way, if you study and read more about him, you realize that a lot of what he wrote and what he said was put together in the U.S. Constitution. Now, some of the impact of the Enlightenment obviously was revolutions. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details for you, but I want you to keep this in mind. You can pause the video so you can see what's going on here. You have Enlightenment ideas, obviously. Then you have the spread of those ideas, and those ideas actually brought a whole bunch of revolutions all over the world. This included the United States Revolution primarily, and then the Haitian Revolution, and then you had revolutions in South America, revolutions in France. So Enlightenment ideas brought a whole bunch of changes to the entire world. And here you can actually stop the video and read over this, the similarities, differences between the Magna Carta and the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. And now we are actually going to take a few minutes so we can review your lesson activities for this tutorial. And the first questions have to do with government through the Middle Ages. You have different questions in this slide here. You actually have 2 questions. And question number 1 says, according to the article, which you should have read already, how did the Magna Carta restrict the power of the king? We talked about this. We mentioned that the king was restricted in collecting taxes. The other part of the question here, or the prompt, is what benefit did the nobles receive from restricting the king? Well, the nobility benefited because the Magna Carta defined individual rights and emphasize the role of laws in society. So you're more than, by the way, there's more than one answer. I'm just giving you ideas on what you can include in your answer. Now, part B here is talking about which part of English society was completely exempted from restrictions under the Magna Carta. If you remember, we talked about the church. We mentioned that the church was actually exempted from this. So this is one way that you can have an understanding of what you can write as an answer here. And please make sure, I do want to mention this, that when you're asked to write one paragraph, please make sure you write one paragraph, not one sentence. When you're asked to write an essay, please make sure that you write an essay and not necessarily one paragraph or 2 sentences. Now, moving on to question number 3, or part C of government through the Middle Ages. What we have here is which powers were left to the king, what was important about the powers that remain with the king. So again, you can go back to this video and you can actually review some of those answers there. If you can think about, taxes, was that left to the king? And moving on to part D, explain how clause 39 of the Magna Carta was influential in the American Revolution. Well, we talked about this extensively. How was clause 39 important to the American Revolution? And obviously, we talk about the rights. We talk about the rights that the king violated. We talk about how the king didn't respect the rights of the colonists, and your answer should follow that train of thought. So please make sure that you go back to this presentation to learn more or get caught up with what you need to write down here. Now, the other part that we need to focus on is the Enlightenment. And we talked about 2 different people. We talked about Thomas Hobbes, and we talked about John Locke. These are 2 of the most influential individuals in U.S. history, basically. So make sure that you go back and you read and you answer. It's asking you to write a 2 to 3 paragraph reflective essay. You need to say how Mr. Hobbes interpreted the role of government and how did he view people within that role of government. And then you can actually go to John Locke and also interpret what he said. What did he say about government? How did government, or is government supposed to treat people? And you need to put together a good essay here. By the way, I normally say that an essay has to have 5 paragraphs. In this case, it can have obviously your introduction, and your thesis statement, a 3-body paragraph, and a conclusion. So this will actually help you, by the way, when you get to college, because you will be forced to actually write a whole bunch of paragraphs that demonstrate your ability, your skills in writing. So make sure that you follow through on this. If you have questions, make sure you go back to this tutorial, and all of the answers, you will have them in this presentation. You have a good one, and please continue to learn, continue to submit your units, and good luck as you move forward in this class.